So we're going to start by a demo, that some of you may have seen. So if you have, don't say anything. If you haven't, let's do this thing where we're counting how many times the players wearing white are passing the ball. So there's a white shirt team, black shirt team, and players wearing white is going to pass the ball. We're counting how many times they're passing it. All right? Ready?
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes.
How many was it? How many did you count? 15. All right. So that's besides the point, right? That was an attention demanding task. You go back and see. So some of you have seen this because they show this in, I think, undergrad attention courses. But those of you who had not seen this, did you see the gorilla? Yeah? Everyone saw the gorilla? Even if you had not seen this? That seems surprising to me.
Selective attention. Ball.
So as we're counting the passes of the white team, right? A gorilla enters from the right side and spends some time on the screen, and then it goes off. So when this demo works, what you get is that a lot of people, the first time I did it, I did not see the gorilla. Like I was just counting the passes and I did not pay attention to the gorilla. And that's the topic of today. So attention, William James famously said, everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thoughts. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, and is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scattered brain state. Now, this is a nice definition. A lot of us can relate to this, right? You could be attending to what I'm saying right now. A moment later, you could be attending to maybe the pressure of the chair on your back. You could be attending to, maybe the pressure of a pen on your finger. You could be attending to a memory from a past event. You could be thinking about your grade, right? So this train of thought where at any given moment, you're taking possession of something, spending some, mental energy on it, and then moving on to the next thing, next thing, next thing. And that sort of is what people think of attention. Now, what is the problem with that definition? Non-deliberate, like what?
Your background.
Mm. A lot of time you're not, so that's the idea, right? Are you conscious of it? So again, I'm giving away the answer. You want to say something? No. I think the idea is, as I said, are you conscious of it? The problem with definition is that it's too broad, right? If I remove attention and put awareness or put consciousness, this definition still works, right? If I said this is the definition of consciousness, would I be wrong? Like, would you have a problem with it? What problem would you have?
Too narrow.
Okay. I think that would be different. Yeah. So you're right. It would be too narrow. But visual awareness probably would work, right? This definition works for visual awareness. So For a long time, people who wanted to study consciousness would not be able to because it wasn't an academic thing to study. Maybe in the last 20 years, it had become again. But before that, people wanted to study conscious perception, and they would study attention, and they would sell their work under the umbrella of attention. And it really broadened the definition of the field. So one way to think about attention in the definition of William James in general is that when you are attending to something, you're paying attention as if it's a limited amount of coin or resources that you have. And when you give it to something, it always comes at a cost of withdrawing from other things, right? The demo that I showed, for a lot of people, when you're doing an attention demanding task, when you're counting the number of passes of one team, you're becoming somewhat blind, and we talk about that in attentional blindness. You're becoming somewhat blind to the other stuff. So there's always, you get certain benefits, but it comes at a certain cost. So it's a limited resource that you allocate to one thing and you take away from another thing. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about today and next week is what we call selective attention. And this is our ability to focus processing on a particular thing and ignore everything else. So this is what we're interested in studying. There is a topic of divided attention where people who are mostly trained can maybe attend to multiple things. It's about tracking multiple things, but it's very limited. And we're not going to spend any time on it, really. We're going to talk about selective attention. And selective attention is what William James was talking about. It's really this sort of taking possession of one thing, paying attention to it, allocating processing to it, and this comes at a cost to other things. So what are the consequences of giving something your attention? This was a famous study by Posner, where this is a very simple paradigm. You have lights could appear on either side of the screen, and you have a cue that could appear in the middle. Now, the cue could be valid, which means that the direction that it points, the light will appear in that side of the screen. Okay? It could be an invalid cue. It means that it points into a certain direction, but light appears in the other location. So the way this experiment runs, this is what the participants see on the first screen. The first screen is this with a cue. And then the second screen is this. The cue disappears, a light appears, and the participant have to respond as fast as possible. So you get what the paradigm is? It's very simple. Now the cue could be valid. The light appears on the side where the previous screen indicated. It could be invalid. The light appears on a side that the previous screen indicated to the opposite of it. Or it could be a neutral cue where it's not pointing into either direction. And then so this screen, the top screen would come up, and then the bottom screen would come up. And the participants are supposed to respond as fast as possible when they detect the light. Now, what would you expect the pattern to be? Which one of them would be fastest? Valid cue, right? When people get, so this is reaction time. When the cue matches where the light appears, people are faster and the interpretation would be that because they're spatially attending to that. What would be the slowest? When the cue is invalid. And this is the cost that comes when you're spatially attending to some place in a space. If the light appears in a different place, you are less likely to detect it, right? You have because there is a cost into not attending to this part and attending to this part. And the cost shows up as what? As a longer reaction time versus the neutral. So when there is no cue, or the cue is neutral, there's a reaction time, and you kind of measure the other conditions relative to that neutral cue. Does everyone get what the paradigm is and what the pattern is? So imagine in an experiment like this, let's say you have 100 trials. 50 of them usually, let's say, have neutral cues. So It's just because you want to get a good data for that. But valid cues, let's say other 50, you could imagine that 80% of them may be valid cues. Why would we do that? Why would we have 80% valid cue, let's say 20% invalid cue trials?
Like the participant.
Yeah, so if let's say it was 20% valid and 80% invalid, what would it do to the pattern of like data that we're seeing, for example? Yeah, like they would think that invalid is probably better or something, right? Like, oh, if it's always appearing in that opposite direction. So the idea is that we want to get like people's trust or something, right? They want to actually expect it, right? So we want to create expectation. If 80% of the time is valid, they actually, when they see the cue pointing in this direction, they're actually going to attend to this area, right? You want them to actually do that in order for you to see the pattern that you're looking for. But the paradigm, as I said, is very simple. Two screens. One screen comes up with where the light could appear and a cue. That could be three different ways. And then the next, it goes down, the next screen comes up, there's a light, they have to respond as fast as possible. It's a very simple paradigm to show this effect, where validly cued lights were detected faster than neutrally cued lights, which are detected faster than invalidly cued lights. This is your expectation, but it's important to verify this experimentally, that when you're attending to something, there is actually a cost to the areas that you're not attending to. And that cost is in this shift of attention. This is what we call a spatial attention, because you're attending a different location in the space. If you're attending to this part of this space or that part of this space, this is a spatial attention. And this interacts a lot with eye movements, and we're going to talk about it. The way we spatially attend to a lot of areas is that we move our eye to it. Sometimes we don't, and we talk about the differences later. So the demo that I showed earlier, so one effect of, we're talking about what are the consequences of giving something your attention. And one consequence is that you are faster at processing information from that part of the space. So if you actually know information is coming from somewhere, you would attend to it, you're faster at responding to it. That's one consequence of giving something your attention. Another consequence is that when you are engaged in attention-demanding tasks, you often fail to notice irrelevant, even if they're salient stimuli. So this is an experiment done here at New School. Arian Mack was, I think she retired recently, but they did a lot of experiment on this, what we call inattentional blindness. This is basically the invisible gorilla experiment. So what is the task? The task is that the subject sees this pattern, it's a cross, and their task is to indicate which arm is longer. Is it the horizontal line or vertical? In this case, is the vertical, right? The vertical line is longer, so that's their task. They do this for many trials. They're across appearing, they say horizontal or vertical. Then in one trial, you get so one thing to mention is that if this was up for a while, this would be an easy task, right? So the way you do it is that you flash it briefly. It's just a brief presentation. In some trials or in a trial, when you flash the cross, you also flash another object with it. Okay, so the cross comes up with another object and it goes down. Then you ask people after they respond which arm is longer, you say, which object did you see in the screen as well? What would people say a lot of time? No, not in this case, it's triangle, but they don't know. So most of the time, because they're doing another attention demanding task, they would be at chance. They would not know. A lot of them would like, I don't know what the object was, because they are doing another task. Does that make sense? So this is, again, that if you wanted to turn that invisible gorilla into an experiment, this is what it would look like. That's the idea I'm trying to communicate. Because you made them do a very different attention demanding task. They really have to attend to this. Imagine if briefly, let's say it's flashing for 50 milliseconds. So if it's a 50 millisecond cross comes up and goes out, you have to really attend to that area to be able to do this task. Yeah.
Is there not like a preference for the bottom right one? Spot?
Same spot.
see-
Oh, you mean task-wise?
Yeah,
No, but the idea here, I see what you mean. But the idea is that, so this is a schematic. Don't think of this as the way we're presented. It could be presented just on a line. This is just a schematic. But the idea is that because they were doing the other attention demanding task, they did not even see a lot of them that there was an object there, right? Because they're attending to a certain part of the space. Now, what is the problem with this experiment? Like, what makes this experiment difficult, you think? We're collecting a lot of data.
I feel like multiple of these trials, like the kind of filler and with that shells. Whereas like the very first trial, they would
Exactly. So those of you who had not seen the demo that I showed earlier, that demo will never work on you again, right? That will never work, right? You know what to look for. And that's the thing. So with these tasks, you could only get one trial with each subject, right? Just one trial where you have them do the attention demanding task for a while, which is the cross. And then in one trial, you also flash another object with the cross. And then you ask them what the object was. And they say, I don't know what the object was. You cannot do that trial again, because if you do it, they're going to pay attention to they're going to expect there another object in the screen, right? And that's the problem, right? You only get one trial with every subject. So in order to collect a lot of data, you have to have a lot of subjects, and from each of them, you just collect one data. So the idea is that inattentional blindness is the blindness you have to things that you're not attending to when you're attending to another very task demanding object or visual input. In this case, the very demanding visual input is this cross that is flashing, and you have to say which arm is longer. Another object flashes with it, you're kind of blind to it. So you're attending to something makes you blind to another thing. That's another consequence of attention. Does that paradigm seem so? You've seen the exam questions. So I'm going to ask you, for example, to explain this paradigm and the result. Or I would ask you to explain this paradigm and the results and why it's important, right? These sorts of questions going to appear on the exam. So what are the consequences of giving something your attention? In the Posner experiment, we saw that attention to a location in a space, it speeds the processing, it speeds up the processing of information at that location. And from the Mack and Rock experiment, we saw that attention is needed for object to reach awareness. So this is the connection that we have with awareness, right? They wanted to study visual awareness, and in a way, they're making a distinction here between attention and awareness. They're saying attention is needed for object to reach awareness. So is there a case where you attend to something and you don't have awareness of them? I'm not sure. So at the time, the wording, they didn't want to make attention and awareness the same thing. So you word it this way. But in a lot of cases, you need to be able to attend to objects in order to be aware of them. And that's the whole inattentional blindness. And people have done a lot of experiment, like, oh, what if we had the demanding task in one eye and then that eye, and then they did a ton of things. But the general point of those experiments is that if you're doing an attention demanding task, then you are likely to be blind to other objects, even if they're salient. Like even, the gorilla example is supposed to show that, look, there's a, very salient gorilla here, and you're not able to be aware of it because you're not attending to it, and your attention is in something else. But expectation is a big part of that. You're not supposed to be expecting that, right? You're expecting to do a simple task. So that's a big part of it. Okay, so what are the neural mechanisms of selective attention? So what is it that causes this sort of behavioral pattern that we're seeing, right? You're faster at responding to things that you're attending to, and the stuff that you're not attending to are likely to be not even be registered. You're not going to be aware of them. So this is an important study in attention, where the paradigm, again, this is simplified, but the paradigm is we have, let's say, a large receptive field, and you have two objects in them. So far, we didn't really talk about this. So far, we were always worried about, oh, what if I have this object in the receptive field, or I don't have an object in the receptive field? So how would the cell respond? But let's say you have, in higher areas, you have receptive fields that are larger. Now here, I'm showing the fixation point to be here. And I have two objects in the receptive field of this neuron. So the monkey is fixating here, and this is a monkey neurophysiology experiment. So the monkey is fixating here, and the receptive field cell is here. Now, the monkey remains fixated throughout the experiment. Why is that? Why is that important that the monkey would remain fixated throughout the experiment? Why would it change if the eye moves?
I guess like if it's a certain size and I'm but like I have this fixation point here, and then I'm now more attentive to the area below, and I might sacrifice some of the area like above, I guess, that I was looking at. It's like it would change, not like it wouldn't drastically change, but it would just change a little bit. So it would, I mean, the reason I bring that up is that perhaps you're not necessarily measuring the same thing throughout the course of the experiment. Is that?
Yeah, I think you're on the right track, but you backtracked. I don't know. You could go all the way. You could. I feel like.
Oh,
Yeah, you want it.
You're looking at it, right?
Yeah.
So okay, if I'm a monkey, right, and I'm looking at the black dot right now, I know that there are two objects underneath it in the little box, but I don't actually see details of them because I'm fixating on that point. But if I change where I'm looking and I'm looking directly at those objects, it defeats the whole purpose of the experiment because I can see them.
Exactly, right? That's a good point. Because the receptive field moves when you move your eye, right? And that's the point, right? Why, if I move my eye, why the receptive field is, so that's why retinotopy is important. Everything is relative to where your eye is. For example, if I'm looking at this bottle, right? And I'm looking at you and the bottle is here, this bottle is going to my right hemisphere. Now, if I look here, the bottle goes to my left hemisphere. You see what I mean? When I move my eye, the entire visual input on the retina changes. And if the entire visual input on the retina changes, then everything changes. All the responses change. The cell is not looking at this here. So let's say you have a cell, and in this case, so let's say this is my fixation point up here, and this is the receptive field of a cell. Where is this cell? Physically, where is this neuron located? If I'm looking at this point, and the receptive field is here, according to this schematic, where is this neuron physically located? Where would it be? Is it in the right hemisphere or left hemisphere? What's that? Left. Why is it left? Yeah, right. If I'm fixating at this point and the receptive field is here, this neuron that has this receptive field, right? A neuron has a receptive field. The receptive field is an area that the neuron responds to. This has to be on, the neuron has to be in the left hemisphere because it's processing information from the right visual field. Does that make sense to everyone? So physically, it's located in the left hemisphere because I'm looking here, and this receptive field means that, okay, this is the part that this neuron responds to, it's in the left hemisphere. Is it on the, I don't want to get into the dorsal or ventral, but the idea is that it is on the higher, it's on the dorsal part of the that hemisphere. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, how does, talk about it on the left, the right, because your process, then on the right, the left, process, how does that relate to what we talked about with what's crossing the?
So this, yeah. So this has to do with that, right? So let's say, let's do this again. So if I'm looking here, if the monkey is looking here and the receptive field is in this area, it means that, again, this is a schematic. The receptive field doesn't exactly look like this. But the idea is that, let's say the receptive field was in the lower right quadrant. It means that this cell is located in the left hemisphere of the monkey, in the visual area. It's in the dorsal part of it, right? You learn that dorsal goes up. Why is it in the dorsal part of it and not on the lower ventral part of it? No, well, no, I know where you're going, but in this case, given the location of this receptive field, why is it in the dorsal part? Like, because it's a lower, so there is a flipping, right? There's a flipping of this space. So if the receptive field is on the lower right half of the visual field, the neuron physically has to be located in the left hemisphere and on the dorsal part of it. That's the idea. So physically, the neuron is located there. You ask the optic chiasm, the idea is that, well, if the receptive field is here, the eye, right? Let's say the fixation is here and the receptive field here. Means that the visual input from this part of the world reflect both on the left eye and the right eye, and then both of them goes to the left hemisphere. Does that make sense? All right. So now, if I move my eye a little bit, like let's say the fixation point from here moves to this point. What happens to the receptive field of the same neuron? Where would that be? We just talked about if this is the receptive field with respect to the fixation point, that neuron would be in the dorsal part of the left hemisphere. If the fixation moves to this point, what happens to the receptive field of the same neuron? Where would that be? Switches, where would, on the screen, where would that be?
If it's on the right side of the visual field.
We're talking about the same neuron, right? We're talking about the same cell. What happens to the receptive field of the same cell? It moves off the screen, right? Why? Because, well, the neuron is still in the dorsal part of the left hemisphere. It has to look, the receptive field will be on the right, bottom right of the screen of the fixation point. Does that make sense? Why receptive field is only relative to the fixation point. It doesn't exist by itself. Why? Because, well, we established that when a neuron has this receptive field, it has to be on this part of the brain. It has to be exactly here, which is left hemisphere a little up. If it has to be exactly here, then when I move my eye, it's the same neuron, and the same neuron can only look at the bottom right part of the fixation point. For that long answer, you cannot move your eye during an experiment. So because we want to make sure that, so when you do neurophysiology experiment, you spend the whole day finding a cell, right? You find a cell, you target a cell, a very narrow electrode enters the brain, and you reach a certain point, then you could find the receptive field. How do you find the receptive field? We talked about this. How do you find the receptive field of the cell? Yeah. Exactly. After you lower the electrode, you just flash light across the screen and then see which part of the screen the cell responds to. This cell happened to respond to this part of the screen. Now, you cannot move the electrode for the next few hours, right? Ideally, you want to keep the same electrode and keep recording from the same cell. So in order to record from the same cell, the monkey has to remain fixated in order for the receptive field to stay in the same location, so you could do the experiment. So a large amount of energy goes to training monkeys to keep fixation, which is not a very natural behavior, right? We move our eye a few times a second. It's not a natural behavior to keep fixated. Yeah.
So then, if what you were saying for the fixation point,
Mhm.
how is that the same?
Because you're recording from the same neuron. But these stimuli would fall in another neuron. Is that what you mean? In the receptive field of another neuron. I'm saying, assume we have the same neuron. Let's say I lowered the electrode and I'm recording from a neuron. Assume this is the neuron I'm interested in. And you look at this point and I flash light and I find out the receptive field is here. Now, if you move your eye and then you flash the light and find the receptive field would be here now. Does that make sense? Assume that I'm holding the same neuron. But these images, these bars would now be in the receptive field of another neuron. Where would that neuron be? If a fixation point moves here, these would be in the receptive field of another neuron. Where would that neuron be? If the fixation point is on here. So it would be on the dorsal part of the right hemisphere. Right? There's always millions of receptive fields overlapping any visual point. It's just that when you move your eye, different neurons are now looking at it. Yeah. So as you do an experiment like this, you want the monkey to hold fixation. So you map out the receptive field. So for the rest of the day, you have an electrode that is recording from a neuron, and you know where its receptive field is. And then you show stuff in that receptive field. Yeah? In this case, schematically, this is not the exact experiment, but schematically, let's say the neuron has a preferred stimulus, which is a blue vertical bar. What does that mean if I say this is a preferred stimulus? So what does it mean for the behavior of the cell? It fires, right? It fires a lot. If I say it's a non-preferred stimulus, it means that it fires a little. Now, when we say something fires a lot or fires a little, it doesn't mean that it's involved or not involved in representing the cell. And this is an important point. Why is that? Why is it the cell that even responds little for a stimulus could be part of representing the object? Okay, yeah, there's information there. It's not like, because if that, for example, likes, I don't know, the lower response tells you it's not a blue. So what is a concept we studied last session that tells you about this? That even if a cell is responding little to something, it could be part of its representation. Yeah, how is it related to distributed coding? Exactly, right? So if I'm representing something, I used the phone book example. If you're representing every friend with a combination of color intensities, then if I'm representing someone as a lot blue, a little green, and very tiny yellow, then a tiny yellow is important as a distributed code. You can't just, because it's tiny doesn't mean it doesn't carry information. So it's important to know that you could respond very little to something, but in a distributed way, carry information about the identity, as someone mentioned here, right? If it's not responding a lot, it means that it's not a blue vertical thing. So it's information for you, for the rest of the brain. These are more fundamental concepts that I hope that you think about in terms of why we're doing this. But yeah, think also about this idea of receptive field. I know it's hard to imagine it for some of you, I imagine, but if you think about it more, it makes sense that why receptive field has to be relative to the fixation point, right? And I see some of you are confused about if it moves, well, it goes into the receptive field of another neuron. That's the idea, right? When you move your eye, the visual world goes to the receptive field of some other neuron, right? It doesn't get lost. It's just that the neuron that you're recording from, you spend a few hours targeting, is the one that you actually have targeted, is the one that you can actually record from. So you have to record from that one. So make sure that the objects are in the receptive field of that one. So in this case, when we have a preferred and non-preferred stimulus, we get some firing rate. This firing rate happens to be somewhere in between, right? So if I had only the preferred stimulus, I would have a really high activation. If I have only the non-preferred stimulus, I have a low activation. But if I have two of them in the receptive field, then I get something in between. So let's say the firing rate, the number of spikes, and I'm showing the spikes here, the number of spikes would be somewhere in between. So we'll stop here.